Okay, welcome back. It is 7:30 of 2015. We're going to take a look at a talk I've entitled Time for God, because Brentano is going to discuss deity and divinity within the realm of temporal continuum. And so throughout this talk, we will be concentrating on universality as the backdrop. Now, under event boundary, Brentano tells us there are 5 presentations. There is the eternal sui generis direction of universality. There is the spatial continuum as a whole, the temporal continuum as a boundary, the body of spatial extension, and the body of temporal direction. And because there are 5 presentations, the topoids of things in their place have a tendency to display an additional dimension of chronoids of things in their situated period in time. And there is this backdrop of an eternal corresponding change of universality in ECC, which we seek to ascertain at the de Kunta threshold. Therefore, Brentano says change must be assumed of God. With regard to knowledge and with regard to will, change in God influences all creation. It includes the modification of things and the modification of the properties contained by those things. Therefore, the real and the true is temporally extended for Brentano. The real and the true of the divine backdrop is temporally extended. So we move on to secondary presentation, the realm of the cyclical. We take a look at the secondary presentation out of the event boundary. And Brentano says the spatial continuum as a whole event exists within its temporal boundary of directedness. Therefore, this temporally directed spatial event always represents itself as an imperfect possibility of the universal eternal corresponding change. The event boundary always represents a possibility of its perfect correspondence to the universal, to the eternal, but it is always partially in full correspondence. It is imperfect. It's a possibility of perfection, but it's imperfectly actualized at the time. Therefore, the spatial event in its temporal directedness involves 2 modes of acceptance for the perceiver. And our 2 modes of acceptance concerning this actuality, this event enclosure, consists of accepting it as actual and also accepting its possibility as non-actual. So it's all with regard to the presentation of the universal corresponding change that influences that event enclosure. Therefore, with regard to this spatial event of temporal directedness, we raise its topoids to signs, and we posit a modal continuum of the real as the intentionality which is behind this event boundary of the universal corresponding change, which is the real and the true. So we become aware of variation of object, of variation of topoids, and variation of chronoids. And variation equals the object preserving itself, even though it is involved in existing as being in and for itself at all times, actually evolving within this universality. So we posit an abstracto enclosure of sign genus, which encloses all of these signs as an event that is remotely historical, presently historical, and anticipated as historical. We posit the topoids in temporal continuum, and we appropriate the relevant mark of signification for each topoid by grasping the topoid as a chronoid, and this allows us to reach signification. Now, the sui generis of universal corresponding change is that which imprints our spatial event of temporal directedness. It is always imprinted by this universality. Each event spatial boundary bears a sui generis trait of universality, an imprint, a trait like imprint of universality. And we try to appropriate that at the Da Kunta threshold through dialogue in order to ascertain that universality of the real, of the divine intellect that serves as the backdrop to every event and closure. So this really is all about time in God, about the fact that deity and divinity for Brentano involve most certainly temporal continuum and a temporal extension. God, change must be assumed of God with regard to knowledge and with regard to will. But it's all about positing and the fact that we deal now with non-actual possibilities that we posit for an event. Even though we do recognize and accept the actuality, we also posit the fact that it's involved in a temporal directedness of non-actual possibility, which is still ahead of it. We do this by raising topoids to signs and by recognizing a topoid as a chronoid. So we've got some additional conceptual information here from Brentano and a better picture of the backdrop of universality. And that'll take us up through 88.